Morgan Reynolds stood at the edge of Clearwater Bay, grease-stained hands gripping the steering wheel of her rusted pickup truck. Rain tapped gently against the windshield, creating a hypnotic rhythm that matched her racing heartbeat. The flyer had been shoved under her wiper that morning, bold red letters against faded yellow paper. For sale, retired cruise ship, $11,000, buyer must tow, no returns. Most people would have laughed, crumpled it up, and tossed it away. Morgan wasn't most people. The Aurora star loomed before her, a mammoth shadow against the gray horizon. Once grand, now forgotten, its hull scarred with rust, windows clouded with salt and time. Docked at Pier 17 for over a decade, locals whispered it was haunted, claimed they heard phantom music on windy nights. Ghost stories didn't frighten Morgan. Eviction notices did. Her phone buzzed with another text from her landlord. Final warning, rent due Friday or vacate. She'd fallen 3 months behind on the garage payment. The small mechanic shop that had been her lifeline was slipping away, along with every dream she'd built for herself and Sophie. 8-year-old Sophie was the only brightness in Morgan's increasingly desperate world. Smart as a whip with wild blonde curls and her mother's stubborn determination. The child waited at Mrs. Henderson's apartment after school each day, while Morgan worked late trying to save a business that was drowning in debt. No father in the picture. He'd vanished when Morgan told him she was pregnant during their final year of maritime engineering school. His parting words still echoed, "I have a future. I can't be tied down." Now that future Morgan had sacrificed for her daughter was collapsing. 3 mechanic shops had opened in Clearwater Bay in the past year, all with newer equipment and cheaper rates. Her clients had dwindled to a handful of loyal fishermen who couldn't afford to take their boats elsewhere. Morgan stepped out of the truck, rain soaking through her thin jacket. She'd come to laugh at this absurd proposition, to see the monstrosity up close and confirm it was as ridiculous as it sounded. Instead, as she approached the gangway, something stirred inside her chest. Not hope. She'd learned to live without that luxury, but possibility. The security guard barely glanced up from his magazine. "You the one who called about seeing the ship?" Morgan nodded, surprised by her own voice. "I'm considering buying it." He snorted, not bothering to hide his amusement. "Lady, that thing's been on the market for 2 years. Harbor Master just wants it gone. Become an eyesore. Liability." He tossed her a flashlight. "Electricity's been cut. Watch your step. Some floors might be rotted through." The gangway creaked under her weight, metal groaning like it might give way. Morgan hesitated, calculations running through her mind. This was madness. She had $12,000 to her name, every penny saved toward a better apartment for Sophie, a place with her own bedroom instead of the pull-out couch in their studio. Yet something pulled her forward, the same instinct that told her which engines could be salvaged and which were beyond repair. Her boots left wet prints on the carpeted hallway as she entered the ship. The air inside hung heavy with mildew and abandonment. Wallpaper peeled in long strips like shedding skin. Once elegant fixtures dangled precariously from the ceiling. But beneath the decay, Morgan saw bones. Solid steel construction, quality craftsmanship from an era when things were built to last. She moved through the grand ballroom, flashlight beam dancing across a space that once hosted glamorous evenings. Her mind filled the emptiness with phantom guests in evening wear, orchestra music, champagne toasts. Sophie would love this, the child who created palaces from cardboard boxes and turned their tiny apartment into castles with nothing but imagination. Morgan ventured deeper, methodically exploring each deck. She found staterooms in various states of disrepair, kitchens with industrial-grade equipment, and a theater with seats still intact. The ship had been stripped of valuables but not gutted. Most importantly, the hull appeared sound, no major breaches visible. In the engine room, Morgan felt truly at home. Her flashlight revealed massive diesel engines, neglected but complete. No obvious signs of catastrophic failure. This was a language she understood. Pistons, cylinders, fuel pumps. Her fingers traced the manufacturer's plate, recognizing the model. Parts would be expensive, but not impossible to source. 4 hours later, Morgan emerged from the depths of the Aurora star with pages of notes and a dangerous idea forming. The security guard looked surprised to see her. "Thought maybe you fell through a floor." Morgan barely heard him. Numbers and calculations tumbled through her mind. $11,000 was insane for a cruise ship, even one in this condition. There had to be a catch, something catastrophically wrong that she'd missed. That evening, after tucking Sophie into bed with stories of princesses who sailed the seas, Morgan spread her notes across their small kitchen table. Reality crashed down hard. Even if she could afford the initial purchase, the costs of towing, repairs, permits, and insurance would be astronomical. It was a fool's errand, a desperate gamble by a woman on the brink of losing everything. Sophie's school artwork hung on the refrigerator, a crayon drawing of the two of them standing beside a house with a red door and yellow flowers. Our dream home, she'd proudly announced when presenting it. Not for the first time, Morgan wondered if she was failing her daughter by clinging to independence instead of moving back to her parents' farm in Nebraska. Morning came with rare clarity. Morgan dropped Sophie at school, hugging her tighter than usual. "I love you, sweetheart." Sophie's eyes sparkled with their usual mischief. "Love you more. Can we have pizza tonight?" The harbor master's office smelled of coffee and old paperwork. Morgan stood before the desk, heart hammering as she slid across her check, nearly every cent she had. "I want to buy the Aurora Star." The balding man peered at her over reading glasses. "You understand the condition? Ship needs to be moved within 60 days or you forfeit both vessel and payment." Morgan nodded, signing where indicated, becoming the improbable owner of a 300-foot cruise ship with no clear plan beyond survival. The key felt heavy in her palm, a small, ordinary key that now represented the biggest risk of her life. News traveled fast in Clearwater Bay. By afternoon, her phone buzzed with messages from concerned friends and curious acquaintances. Her former maritime engineering professor called, voice tight with worry, "Morgan, this isn't the way to solve financial problems. That ship is a money pit." Only Mrs. Henderson, their elderly neighbor who watched Sophie after school, offered genuine encouragement. "Sometimes the craziest decisions are exactly what we need. My Harold bought a failing restaurant during the recession of '82. Everyone thought he'd lost his mind. That place put our kids through college." Sophie's reaction was exactly as Morgan had anticipated. When she picked her up from school and drove to the harbor, the child's eyes widened to perfect circles. "Is that a real ship?" When Morgan explained they now owned it, Sophie's squeal of delight echoed across the water. "We have a castle." That evening, they brought sleeping bags, flashlights, and a picnic dinner aboard. Sophie raced through corridors, claiming rooms and spinning elaborate stories about the adventures they would have. Morgan followed more cautiously, mentally cataloging urgent repairs and safety concerns. They set up camp in what had been the captain's quarters, the cleanest space Morgan could find with intact windows and solid flooring. As they ate sandwiches by flashlight, Sophie's imagination transformed their surroundings. The creaking of the hull became secret messages from mermaids. The distant sound of harbor bells became calls from magical creatures. When Sophie finally drifted to sleep, Morgan stood at the porthole, staring at the twinkling lights of Clearwater Bay. The enormity of what she'd done pressed down on her shoulders. Either she'd just made the most catastrophic mistake of her life, or she'd found their salvation. There would be no middle ground. The next morning began a new reality. Morgan set up a workspace in what had been the ship's administrative office. She created detailed inventory lists and prioritized repairs. The most pressing concern was securing the vessel. Several access points needed better locks and reinforcement. With Sophie at school, Morgan spent days fixing broken doors, boarding vulnerable windows, and creating a safe path through the labyrinth of corridors. Word of the crazy mechanic woman who bought the abandoned cruise ship spread through town. Some came to gawk, others to offer unsolicited advice. A few local fishermen who'd been loyal customers brought spare marine hardware. "Probably won't help much, but it's gathering dust in my shed," one grizzled captain shrugged, dropping off boxes of brass fixtures and lengths of specialized marine-grade wiring. Sophie's school friends begged for tours, which the child proudly conducted, embellishing the ship's history with dramatic tales of pirate treasures and royal passengers. "My mom's going to make it beautiful again," she informed everyone who would listen. "She can fix anything." 2 weeks into ownership, Morgan had established a routine. Mornings at her failing garage, trying to generate enough income to keep the lights on. Afternoons and evenings aboard the Aurora Star, tackling the most critical repairs. Sophie completed homework at a makeshift desk in the captain's quarters, then helped with simple tasks, sorting salvageable items, cleaning what could be cleaned, keeping inventory lists. It was during one such evening that Sophie made the discovery that would change everything. Morgan was deep in the engine room, assessing the fuel system, when Sophie's voice echoed through the communication pipe. "Mom, Mom, Mom, come quick! I found something amazing!" Morgan raced upward, heart pounding with visions of her daughter injured or the ship taking on water. Instead, she found Sophie bouncing with excitement outside a door Morgan had passed dozens of times, a service entrance near the main dining hall, unremarkable except for the faded gold trim around its frame. Sophie held up a small brass key. "I found it under that dead plant pot. It was hidden." The key was tarnished but distinctive, with an ornate head unlike the utilitarian master keys Morgan had received from the harbor master. "Where did you try to use this?" Morgan inspected it carefully. Sophie pointed to the door. "It doesn't work. I think it needs special magic." Morgan examined the door frame, noticing for the first time a subtle difference in the lock mechanism, not standard issue for the ship's general access points. She inserted the key, feeling resistance, then turned it with gentle pressure. Something clicked, and the door swung inward with a dramatic groan. The flashlight beam revealed not a service area but a private lounge. Unlike the rest of the ship, this room appeared largely untouched by time and looting. Leather chairs faced a small mahogany bar. Bookshelves lined one wall, their contents dusty but intact. The air smelled different here, not of mildew and decay, but of aged wood and leather preserved somehow against the elements that had invaded the rest of the vessel. Sophie slipped past Morgan, eyes wide with wonder. "It's a secret room, like in my books." She ran her fingers along the bar surface, leaving trails in the dust. "Who do you think came here?" Morgan examined the space with growing curiosity. A brass plaque on the door's interior read, "Captain's Private Lounge." This wasn't on any of the deck plans she'd reviewed. Personal quarters for senior officers had been clearly marked, but this space, tucked away behind an unmarked door, existed outside the official record. Sophie had already begun exploring every corner, pulling books from shelves and examining trinkets left behind. "Mom, look at this!" She held up a leather-bound logbook, different from the standard maritime logs Morgan had found in the bridge. Before Morgan could examine it, something else caught her attention. Behind the bar, the wood paneling didn't quite align. Years of working with engines had trained her eye to spot misalignments, places where parts didn't fit perfectly. She ran her fingers along the seam, feeling a slight draft. "Sophie, bring the flashlight here." Together they found a recessed latch. With gentle pressure, the panel swung inward, revealing a narrow staircase leading downward. Cold air rushed upward from the darkness below. Sophie clutched Morgan's hand. "Is it a dungeon?" Morgan hesitated at the threshold. The ship's blueprints had shown nothing below this level except standard hull infrastructure. "Stay right behind me. If I say run, you run back up these stairs without arguing. Understand?" The staircase was metal, solid despite years of disuse. Their flashlight beams danced ahead as they descended, revealing a landing and then a heavy door with an electronic keypad, dead without power. But the door stood slightly ajar, as if someone had left in haste and failed to secure it properly. Morgan pushed it open, revealing a space that defied all expectation. Unlike the ornate lounge above, this was clearly designed for functionality. Climate control systems, inactive now, lined one wall. The room was filled with crates and containers, meticulously arranged and labeled. Not the random storage Morgan might have expected, but an organized collection. Sophie whispered in awe, "Is this pirate treasure?" Morgan approached the nearest crate, examining the label. Series of numbers, dates, and a name she didn't recognize. The lid wasn't sealed, just resting in place. She lifted it carefully, revealing layers of protective packing material. Beneath, wrapped in acid-free paper, lay a painting, vibrant colors somehow preserved in the darkness. The signature in the corner made her breath catch, Kandinsky. "That can't be real," Morgan whispered to herself, carefully replacing the protective covering. She moved to another container, smaller and more secure. Inside, nestled in velvet, sat a bronze sculpture, its graceful lines unmistakably reminiscent of Rodin's work. A third container revealed a collection of ancient coins arranged in museum-quality display cases. Sophie moved between the crates, peering into those she could reach. "Mom, there's so many. What is all this stuff?" Morgan stood frozen, mind racing to make sense of what they'd discovered. This wasn't random cargo left behind or forgotten storage. This was a collection, valuable enough to warrant a hidden vault, climate control, and security systems. The implications were staggering. If even half of these items were authentic. A flicker of movement caught her eye. A motion sensor had detected their presence. A small monitor mounted on the far wall blinked to life, running on some backup power source. The screen flickered, and then a man's face appeared. Late 60s, distinguished, wearing a captain's uniform. "If you're watching this, then I'm either gone or you've done what no one else has managed, believed in the Aurora star enough to find her secrets." The recording was clearly prepared years earlier, the man speaking directly to the camera with calm authority. "I was Captain Edward Blackwood, master of this vessel for 27 years. But I was more than just her captain. I became custodian of something extraordinary." Sophie pressed against Morgan's side, watching transfixed as the captain continued. "During the Aurora's service years, she became a trusted repository for collections that needed to remain mobile and secure. Art dealers, museums facing political instability, private collectors concerned about theft or conflict. They came to trust our discretion and security. The vault you're standing in holds items that, for various reasons, could not remain in fixed locations during turbulent times." The captain's expression grew solemn. When the shipping line decided to retire the Aurora, arrangements were made to transfer these collections. But global events, which you can research in the logs, created complications. The owners of these items became unreachable. Some had died. Others disappeared during conflicts or regime changes. The shipping company knew nothing of this operation. It was private, between myself and the clients who trusted me. He leaned closer to the camera. "I couldn't allow these treasures to be lost or looted when the ship was sold for scrap. So I created this message, secured the vault, and arranged for the Aurora to be held in bureaucratic limbo, neither scrapped nor officially abandoned. I had hoped that eventually conditions would allow for proper repatriation of these items." The recording continued with instructions for accessing the ship's secret logs and inventory system, but Morgan barely heard the words. The implications were overwhelming. They'd stumbled upon what appeared to be a hidden collection of art and artifacts, potentially worth millions if authentic. Items with complex histories, contested ownership, and unknown provenance. When the recording ended, the screen went dark, leaving them in the beam of their flashlights. Sophie tugged at Morgan's sleeve. "Are we rich now? Can we keep it all?" The question jolted Morgan back to reality. "No, sweetheart. If these things are real, they belong to someone. We need to figure out who." That night, after Sophie had finally fallen asleep, Morgan sat alone in the captain's lounge, surrounded by logbooks and papers she'd brought up from the vault. The captain's private records told a fascinating story. For decades, the Aurora Star had served as more than a pleasure cruise ship. It had been a floating sanctuary for treasures at risk. During political upheavals, regime changes, and conflicts, families and institutions had secretly transferred valuable collections aboard for safekeeping. Captain Blackwood had maintained meticulous records of each deposit, including contacts, ownership documentation, and correspondence. But the final entries, dated shortly before the ship's decommissioning, expressed growing concern. Many clients had become unreachable. War, displacement, and changing borders had scattered people across the globe. Morgan ran her fingers over a manifest listing paintings, sculptures, rare books, and historical artifacts. A conservative estimate would place the value well into 8 figures. The enormity of their discovery left her breathless. This wasn't just about money. These were pieces of history, culture, and personal heritage that had been presumed lost. Dawn found Morgan still awake, mind racing with possibilities and responsibilities. She needed expert advice, someone who could authenticate the collection and help navigate the complex ethical and legal questions. But who could she trust with such a discovery? The wrong person could exploit the situation, claim the treasures for themselves, or worse. She remembered a name, William Harrington, former naval officer turned maritime historian. He'd guest lectured at her engineering school, impressing students with his integrity as much as his knowledge. A quick internet search revealed he had retired to a coastal town just 30 miles north. Sophie spent the day with Mrs. Henderson, convinced she was helping her mother with a super-secret ship project. Morgan drove north along the coast, rehearsing how to explain her incredible situation without sounding delusional. Harrington's cottage sat on a bluff overlooking the ocean, surrounded by native plants and driftwood sculptures. The man himself matched his environment, weathered, sturdy, with alert eyes that missed nothing. He invited Morgan in without questions, offering tea and patience as she struggled to begin her story. "Mr. Harrington, I recently purchased the Aurora Star. It was docked at Clearwater Bay, decommissioned about 10 years ago." Recognition flickered in his eyes. Blackwood's ship, beautiful vessel in her day. The mention of the captain's name gave Morgan courage to continue. She explained their discovery of the vault, the recorded message, and the apparent value of the collection. Harrington's expression remained neutral, giving nothing away until she finished. "You haven't told anyone else about this?" His tone was carefully measured. Morgan shook her head. "Just my daughter who found the key. She's 8, thinks it's all a grand adventure." Harrington stood abruptly. "Wait here." He disappeared into another room, returning with a photo album and a small box. The album contained photographs of a younger Harrington in naval uniform, standing alongside Captain Blackwood. Edward was more than a colleague, he was a friend. He opened the box, revealing a medallion identical to one Morgan had seen in the captain's lounge. "We were part of something called the Geneva Association, not officially recognized, nothing so formal, just a network of people committed to protecting cultural heritage during unstable times." For the next hour, Harrington filled in the gaps that the logbooks had left. The Aurora Star had indeed served as a floating repository during periods of conflict. Museums facing bombardment, Jewish families fleeing persecution, institutions and countries experiencing revolution, all had found a temporary haven for their treasures aboard the ship as it moved between international waters. The arrangement worked because the Aurora was always moving, crossing borders legally, with legitimate passengers and cargo. The vault was Edward's innovation. Unregistered on official plans, climate-controlled, secure. Harrington's voice held unmistakable admiration. "When the shipping line decommissioned the vessel, we faced a crisis. Many owners had been lost in conflicts or couldn't be contacted. Edward refused to abandon the collections to uncertain fate." Morgan leaned forward. "So he arranged for the ship to remain in limbo." Harrington nodded. "Called in every favor, created bureaucratic knots that would take years to untangle. The plan was to buy time until we could locate rightful owners or their heirs." His expression darkened. "Edward died 5 years ago. Heart attack. The network lost momentum without him. I'd assumed the collections had been quietly liquidated or claimed by opportunists." He fixed Morgan with an intense gaze. "If what you've found is what I think it is, you're sitting on one of the greatest undocumented collections of displaced cultural treasures in recent history. Conservatively, we're talking $75 million in market value, but the historical and cultural significance is incalculable." The figure struck Morgan like a physical blow. $75 million, enough to solve every financial problem she'd ever have, to give Sophie opportunities beyond imagination. And yet, these items belong to someone. Families who lost everything else to war or persecution. Harrington smiled for the first time. "Edward would have liked you, yes. Our primary mission was always reunification, returning treasures to rightful owners when safe conditions allowed." He closed the photo album carefully. "But powerful people will come looking once word gets out. People who see only monetary value, not human stories." As if summoned by his warning, Morgan's phone chimed with a text from Mrs. Henderson. "A man in a gray suit came asking questions about you and the ship. Very official seeming. Didn't like that I wouldn't tell him where you were." Morgan showed Harrington the message, unease crawling up her spine. "I haven't told anyone what we found." "You didn't need to. The Aurora's reputation wasn't completely unknown in certain circles. Edward created smokescreens, but people have suspected something valuable remained aboard." Harrington gathered his keys. "I'm coming back with you. You'll need help securing the vault properly." The drive back to Clearwater Bay was tense with unanswered questions. Who was asking about the ship? How much did they know? Harrington explained that over the years, rumors had circulated about the Aurora Star's secret cargo. Most dismissed it as maritime legend, but some had pursued the theory with disturbing persistence. A group called the Collective has been particularly determined. They present themselves as cultural preservation experts, but they're essentially high-end art traffickers. They identify contested or vulnerable collections and exploit legal gray areas to acquire them. Morgan gripped the steering wheel tighter. And they know about the Aurora? They've suspected. Edward played a cat-and-mouse game with them for years. Now that you've purchased the ship officially, you've inadvertently signaled that the vessel is accessible again. When they arrived at the harbor, Morgan's worst fears were confirmed. A sleek black car was parked near the gangway, and a man in an expensive gray suit stood on the deck, apparently attempting to gain entry. Morgan recognized him instantly as the harbor master's associate, who had lingered during the sale transaction, asking casual but probing questions about her plans for the vessel. Conrad Wells, Harrington muttered, the Collective's acquisition specialist, legal background, diplomatic connections, and absolutely ruthless. Morgan's heart raced as she parked. Sophie and Mrs. Henderson are expecting me at her apartment. I need to make sure they're safe before dealing with this. Harrington nodded. Go. I'll engage Wells, keep him talking. He doesn't know me personally, though he'll recognize the name. I'll imply I'm advising you on maritime restoration. Nothing more. Mrs. Henderson's apartment was on the third floor of a faded building 3 blocks from the harbor. Morgan took the stairs 2 at a time, knocking urgently. Sophie opened the door, face lighting up. Mom, Mrs. Henderson made cookies and I drew pictures of our ship castle. The elderly woman appeared behind Sophie, concern etched in the lines of her face. That man was very insistent, Morgan. Asked when you'd purchased the ship, whether you'd found anything interesting aboard. I didn't like his manner, so I told him nothing. Morgan hugged her. Thank you. Can Sophie stay a bit longer? There's a situation at the ship I need to handle. Back at the harbor, Morgan found Harrington and Wells engaged in seemingly casual conversation on the dock. Wells turned as she approached, offering a smile that didn't reach his cold eyes. Ms. Reynolds, I presume. Conrad Wells, representing certain interested parties. He extended a hand that Morgan reluctantly shook. I understand you've recently acquired the Aurora Star, a fascinating vessel with quite a history. Morgan kept her expression neutral. Just an opportunity that presented itself. I'm a mechanic. I see potential where others see scrap. Wells nodded as if she'd confirmed something. Indeed, sometimes the most valuable things are hidden beneath unpromising exteriors. He glanced toward the ship. I represent clients who have historical interest in vessels of this class. They've authorized me to offer you a generous compensation for any artifacts or items of cultural significance you might discover during your renovation. The threat was subtle but unmistakable. They suspected something but weren't certain enough to make direct claims. Morgan maintained eye contact. I'm not a treasure hunter, Mr. Wells. I'm just trying to save a ship from the scrapyard. Of course. His smile thinned. However, should you encounter anything unusual, documents, artwork, historical items, there could be legal complications regarding ownership. My clients are prepared to handle such complications discreetly and compensate you appropriately. Harrington stepped forward slightly. Ms. Reynolds has engaged me as a maritime history consultant. Any artifacts discovered will be properly documented and addressed according to international salvage conventions. Wells's expression hardened momentarily before he recovered his professional demeanor. William Harrington, your reputation precedes you. He turned back to Morgan, slipping a business card into her hand. My offer stands. Consider it carefully before involving authorities or institutions that might raise complicated questions about provenance and ownership. After he departed, Morgan released a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. He knows something's aboard. Harrington nodded grimly. Or strongly suspects. The Collective has been tracking rumors about the Aurora for years. He glanced at the ship. We need to properly secure the vault and document everything inside before Wells returns with more direct methods of persuasion. The afternoon dissolved into urgent activity. Morgan retrieved Sophie, explaining they had important work to do aboard the ship. The child, sensing the gravity of the situation despite Morgan's reassuring tone, stayed unusually close to her mother's side as they returned to the Aurora Star. Harrington worked methodically, teaching Morgan how to properly document each item in the collection. They photographed, measured, and recorded, identifying details from every crate and container. Sophie helped by organizing papers and holding the flashlight, wide-eyed at the treasures emerging from protective wrappings. Some of these pieces were thought destroyed during the war, Harrington murmured, carefully examining a small wooden box containing ceremonial silver objects. This belonged to the Goldstein family, prominent collectors from Vienna. Their entire collection disappeared in 1938. Most assumed it had been looted and melted down. Sophie peered at the tarnished silver. They look sad. Harrington smiled gently. They've been waiting a long time to go home. As dusk approached, they secured the vault with improved locks and Morgan's own electronic alarm system, repurposed from automobile security equipment. Harrington promised to return the next day with a digital camera and proper archival materials. That night, Morgan insisted they sleep at Mrs. Henderson's apartment rather than aboard the ship. She took the precaution of installing motion sensors at key access points linked to her phone. Sophie, exhausted from the day's excitement, fell asleep clutching her stuffed rabbit. Morgan sat at Mrs. Henderson's kitchen table, mind spinning with the day's revelations. The Aurora Star wasn't just a crazy gamble or a floating fixer-upper. It was the guardian of lost heritage, a vessel carrying not just steel and wood, but memory and identity. Her phone lit up with a notification from one of the ship's sensors. Someone was aboard. The grainy security camera image showed flashlight beams moving through the main deck corridor. Morgan's heart pounded as she called Harrington, who promised to contact harbor security and meet her at the ship. By the time Morgan arrived, local police were already securing the scene. 2 men had been caught attempting to break into the lower decks. They carried professional tools and claimed to be salvage workers hired by the previous owner. When pressed, they had no documentation to support their story. Morgan watched from the dock as the men were taken into custody. Their expressions remained impassive, professional. Not opportunistic thieves, but hired hands working methodically. Wells was escalating faster than anticipated. Harrington joined her, face grim in the flashing police lights. The collective doesn't waste time. They'll try legal channels next, claims of prior ownership, maritime salvage rights, customs violations. We need to move quickly to establish legitimate provenance for these items. The following morning brought Dr. Alexander Chen, the art historian Harrington had called for expert assistance. Morgan had known him during her university days, a respected professor with connections to major museums and auction houses. His expression upon viewing the vault's contents shifted from scholarly skepticism to unbridled awe. "This is unprecedented," he whispered, carefully examining a painting believed lost for decades. The Kondelman collection, everyone assumed it had been destroyed in the bombing of Dresden. 4 hours, Dr. Chen documented and preliminarily authenticated key pieces. His verdict sent shockwaves through Morgan's already tilting world. Conservatively, $75 million, potentially much more for certain pieces with significant historical provenance. But the true value is incalculable. These are pieces of cultural heritage thought lost forever. Morgan sat heavily on a storage crate. What do we do now? Dr. Chen's answer was measured. Legally, maritime salvage law could grant you certain rights as the vessel's owner. But ethically, he glanced at the carefully packed crates. These items have families, communities, and nations waiting for their return. That evening, as Sophie slept in their makeshift quarters aboard the ship, Morgan made a decision that would alter the trajectory of their lives. She would not claim these treasures as her own, would not sell them to the highest bidder, or surrender them to the collective. Instead, she would become their temporary guardian, a link in the chain of protection that Captain Blackwood had begun. She began a simple blog anonymously documenting their discovery with carefully obscured images, enough to establish the collection's existence without revealing its location or detailed contents. She titled it The Forgotten Collection of the Aurora Star and included a secure contact method for legitimate claimants or information. Morgan had just finished the post when her phone chirped with another security alert. This time the breach was at the captain's lounge. She raced upstairs, finding the door ajar, though she was certain she'd locked it. Nothing seemed disturbed at first glance, But when she checked the vault entrance, her blood ran cold. The hidden panel stood open, and one crate had been unsealed. The Rodin sculpture was gone. Morgan secured the vault, heart pounding, and rushed to check on Sophie. The child slept peacefully, unaware of the violation. Morgan spent the night in a chair beside her, wrench in hand, jumping at every creak and groan of the aging vessel. Morning brought no answers, but new complications. The blog had gone viral overnight, attracting attention from art historians, journalists, and collectors worldwide. Morgan's anonymous email account flooded with inquiries, theories, and offers of assistance and acquisition. Harrington arrived early, concern etched across his weathered features. Morgan showed him the empty crate, the sophisticated alarm system that had been bypassed without triggering the main alert. An inside job, he concluded grimly. Someone who knows the ship's systems or had access to specialized knowledge. He hesitated. Morgan, I hate to suggest this, but we need to consider that Dr. Chen might have already thought of that, Morgan interrupted. That's why I didn't tell him about the additional security measures I installed last night. If anything else disappears, we'll know for certain. By midday, the harbor had transformed. News vans parked along the waterfront. Curious onlookers gathered, hoping to glimpse the treasure ship making headlines. Local police established a perimeter, ostensibly for public safety, but effectively creating a buffer between the Aurora star and growing interest. Morgan kept Sophie close, refusing requests for interviews and deflecting questions from increasingly persistent reporters. The child, sensing her mother's attention, remained uncharacteristically subdued. A courier arrived with an envelope addressed simply to the owner of the Aurora star. Inside was a court order demanding Morgan cease any removal or cataloging of items pending investigation of ownership claims filed by the collective's shell corporation. Harrington reviewed the document with mounting concern. They were moving faster than expected. This judge has a reputation for favoring corporate interests. We need proper legal representation immediately. As sunset painted the harbor in gold, Morgan stood on the upper deck, watching the news vans and curious bystanders. Sophie leaned against the railing beside her, small face serious in the fading light. Are the bad people going to take our ship, Mom? Morgan pulled her daughter close. No, sweetheart. This ship found us for a reason. Sometimes the most valuable things are the ones everyone else has forgotten. She didn't hear the soft footsteps behind them until a voice spoke, a sentiment Captain Blackwood would have appreciated. Morgan turned sharply, pushing Sophie behind her protectively. An elderly woman stood watching them, elegant despite her years, with keen eyes that missed nothing. Elizabeth Blackwood, she introduced herself. Edward was my father. I believe you found his legacy, and now it's become yours. As night fell over the Aurora star, the first true guardian of its secrets had returned, and Morgan Reynolds stood at the threshold of a battle that would test every limit of her courage, integrity, and determination. This wasn't just about saving a ship anymore. It was about preserving memory itself. Elizabeth Blackwood carried herself with the composed dignity of someone accustomed to navigating crises. In the captain's lounge, she examined the logbooks with practiced familiarity, fingers tracing her father's handwriting with momentary tenderness before resuming her businesslike demeanor. The collective has been hunting these collections for decades. They're not simply art dealers or collectors. They're cultural strip miners who exploit legal ambiguities to acquire contested treasures. Morgan watched the older woman cautiously, still uncertain whether to trust this new development. How did you find us? Elizabeth's eyes flickered toward the laptop where Morgan's blog remained open. When certain keywords and images appear online, I receive alerts. I've been monitoring for signs of the Aurora's collection since my father's death. She closed the logbook with a decisive snap. You've created quite a stir with your discovery. Your blog has over 1 million views already. Sophie peered at Elizabeth from behind Morgan's arm, curiosity overcoming shyness. Are you really the captain's daughter? Did you live on this ship when it was pretty? Elizabeth's stern expression softened as she addressed the child. I spent many summers aboard the Aurora when I was not much older than you. My father taught me to navigate by stars on this very deck. She turned her attention back to Morgan. The Rodin that was taken, bronze study of a hand, approximately 8 inches tall. Morgan nodded, surprised by the specific knowledge. That piece has already surfaced on the black market. The collective is establishing their claim by demonstrating possession. Elizabeth reached into her handbag, extracting an embossed business card. I represent the Geneva Association, not officially on any corporate records, but we've worked for generations to protect and repatriate cultural treasures displaced by conflict. William Harrington entered the lounge, stopping short at the sight of Elizabeth. Recognition and something more complex passed between them. Lizzie Blackwood, it's been a long time. 23 years, William. Not since father removed you from the association for your questionable methods. Her tone remained neutral, but the tension between them crackled like static electricity. Morgan glanced between them, realizing the alliance she'd been counting on had just fractured. You two know each other. Harrington's weathered face tightened. We worked together during the Balkan conflicts. Different approaches to the same problem. Elizabeth's posture remained rigid. William believes the ends justify the means. I believe how we protect cultural heritage is as important as whether we succeed. She turned to Morgan. Has he suggested selling certain pieces to finance the preservation of others? Or perhaps establishing a private exhibition for select clients? The accusation hung in the air, uncomfortably close to conversations Morgan had dismissed. Harrington had indeed suggested that select items might need to be leveraged to protect the whole collection. The revelation left her questioning everything about their nascent partnership. Sophie, oblivious to the adult tensions, had wandered to the window. Mom, there are more people with cameras outside. The harbor had indeed transformed overnight. What had been a handful of curious onlookers had swelled to a full-fledged media encampment. News vans lined the pier, their satellite dishes aimed skyward. Reporters clutched microphones, delivering breathless updates against the backdrop of the Aurora star. Local police struggled to maintain order as the crowd grew. Morgan's phone buzzed incessantly with notifications from her blog. Thousands of comments, emails, and inquiries flooding in faster than she could possibly process. Among them, an email with the subject line, regarding your recently acquired vessel and contents, urgent legal notice. Elizabeth read over her shoulder. Richard Sterling, the collective's public face, former auction house executive turned private cultural consultant. In reality, he's their acquisition specialist, identifies vulnerable collections and creates legal frameworks to obtain them. The email contained an offer, $30 million for the Aurora star and all contents, no questions asked, transaction completed within 48 hours. The language was polished, professional, and threaded with subtle warnings about potential legal complications and international customs regulations that could arise should Morgan decline. Morgan closed the email, mind racing with calculations. $30 million would solve every financial problem she'd ever faced. Sophie could attend any school, pursue any dream. They could live comfortably for generations. The temptation clawed at her with surprising force. Her phone chimed again, this time her landlord, threatening to padlock her garage for non-payment of rent. The mundane financial crisis felt surreal against the backdrop of multi-million-dollar offers and international art intrigue. Elizabeth seemed to read the conflict on Morgan's face. The collective's initial offers always seem generous. Then come the complications, the renegotiations, the threats. By the time the transaction concludes, you'll receive a fraction of what was promised, and you'll thank them for it. 3 days later, Morgan's small mechanic shop was padlocked. Her tools and equipment held hostage behind a chain-link fence and legal notices. The landlord had moved with unexpected speed, citing multiple violations of lease terms. Morgan recognized the invisible hand of the collective, applying pressure where she was most vulnerable. Sophie watched her mother stare at the locky, small face pinched with worry. Is all your stuff gone forever? Morgan crouched to her daughter's eye level, finding strength in the necessity of appearing confident. Nothing that matters is gone, just things we can replace. The words felt hollow even as she spoke them. Those tools represented years of investment, the physical manifestation of her independence. They returned to the Aurora star, now their only home, to find William Harrington in heated conversation with a tall, immaculately dressed man on the gangway. Richard Sterling in the flesh, more imposing than his photograph suggested, with the practiced charm of someone accustomed to getting his way. Sterling's attention shifted immediately to Morgan. "Ms. Reynolds, I'm delighted to finally meet you. Your discovery has caused quite a stir in certain circles." His smile didn't reach his calculating eyes. "I've taken the liberty of increasing my offer to $35 million. A certified check can be in your hands by tomorrow morning." Sophie pressed against Morgan's side, whispering just loud enough to be heard. "I don't like him, Mom. He looks at our ship like it's candy." Sterling's expression tightened momentarily before his professional mask slipped back into place. "Children have such vivid imaginations. I'm sure she'll appreciate a proper home instead of this floating tetanus hazard." Morgan felt Sophie's small hand slip into hers, squeezing with surprising strength. In that moment, the decision crystallized with perfect clarity. "The Aurora isn't for sale, Mr. Sterling. Not to you, not to anyone." The transformation was subtle but chilling, warmth draining from Sterling's expression, replaced by something coldly efficient. "I strongly advise you to reconsider. My clients have legitimate claims to many items aboard this vessel. The legal process will be lengthy, expensive, and ultimately futile for someone in your financial position." Morgan met his gaze without flinching. "Then I guess I'll see you in court." Sterling departed with manufactured pleasantries that did nothing to disguise the implicit threat. As his sleek black car pulled away from the harbor, Elizabeth emerged from the ship's interior. "You've made a powerful enemy today." The following week validated her warning. Morgan's former customers received mysterious calls questioning her business practices. Sophie's teacher requested a parent conference regarding concerning drawings the child had made, sketches of bad men coming to take away their home. The local building inspector suddenly took interest in the Aurora Star, citing numerous code violations that would cost thousands to address. Most disturbingly, someone had been aboard the ship while they were meeting with Sophie's teacher. Nothing appeared stolen, but items had been moved in the vault, photographic equipment disturbed. The invasion felt deeply personal, a violation of the fragile security Morgan had constructed. Elizabeth moved into a stateroom aboard the Aurora, bringing resources that transformed their defensive posture. Security cameras with motion detection, reinforced locks, a rotating schedule of trusted associates to maintain watch. Morgan found herself in the improbable position of running a floating fortress while preparing for legal battles beyond her experience. The lawsuit arrived with predictable timing. The collective shell corporation, Meridian Cultural Preservation, LLC, claimed prior ownership rights to specific items aboard the Aurora Star, citing complex maritime salvage precedents and international cultural property conventions. The legal language was impenetrable, the documentation overwhelming. Morgan sat in what had become their war room, the former first-class dining salon now covered with legal papers, photographs, and research materials. Sophie had fallen asleep on a makeshift bed in the corner, exhausted from a day of helping catalog smaller artifacts. The sight of her daughter, peaceful despite the chaos surrounding them, renewed Morgan's determination. Elizabeth entered with a tall, distinguished woman in a tailored suit. "Morgan, this is Catherine Walsh. She's agreed to represent us pro bono." The attorney surveyed the room with sharp, assessing eyes. "This case has significant cultural heritage implications. My firm specializes in repatriation of contested artifacts. The publicity alone makes it worthwhile for us." She picked up the lawsuit, scanning it efficiently. "They're moving quickly, requesting an injunction to prevent any removal of items pending ownership determination. Judge Harmon is assigned, not ideal. He tends to favor corporate interests." The legal machinery ground forward with excruciating slowness. Each day brought new motions, counter-motions, and procedural maneuvers. The collective strategy became clear. Drain Morgan's resources, isolate her from support, and force capitulation through attrition. Sophie's school called again. Children were teasing her about living on a garbage ship. The principal, previously supportive, now suggested that perhaps alternative housing arrangements would benefit Sophie's academic and social development. The pressure points were being identified and exploited with surgical precision. Morgan reinforced her daughter's resilience nightly, transforming their circumstances into adventure rather than hardship. "We're not just living on a ship, we're protecting history, like museum guards." but cooler. Sophie nodded solemnly, coloring another picture for their growing gallery of ship artwork. I told Marcus that his stupid apartment doesn't have secret passages or treasure, so he should just shut up. Elizabeth entered their quarters, expression grave. The harbor master received an offer to purchase the entire pier, 3 times market value. The investors remain anonymous, but Morgan finished the thought. The collective. They'll evict us the moment the sale completes. They're targeting every vulnerability. Classic strategic encirclement. Elizabeth spread photographs across the table, aerial views of the harbor taken at different times. Security footage shows individuals photographing access points, analyzing sight lines. They're preparing for something beyond legal maneuvering. That night, Morgan found it impossible to sleep. The Aurora creaked and groaned around her, the sounds no longer comforting but ominous. Every shadow held potential threats, every unexpected noise a possible intrusion. She checked on Sophie repeatedly, irrationally fearful despite the extensive security measures. Near dawn, William Harrington arrived unannounced, his weathered face tight with urgency. They're making a move. Sterling was seen meeting with local contractors specializing in marine salvage. They're planning something imminent. Elizabeth emerged from her quarters, immediately alert despite the early hour. The lingering tension between her and Harrington remained, but crisis temporarily superseded old grievances. The court hearing isn't for another week. They wouldn't risk such an obvious violation of the injunction. Harrington's expression darkened. Unless they've ensured the judge will look the other way, Sterling was photographed dining with Judge Harmon last night. The revelation sent Morgan into action, organizing their most vulnerable documentation into waterproof containers, ensuring backup copies existed off-site. Catherine Walsh arrived shortly after being called, bringing paralegal assistance and equipment to document the current state of every item in the collection. If they're planning to seize items, we need unimpeachable evidence of what exactly was aboard before any intrusion. The attorney directed the cataloging with military precision. We'll file emergency motions this morning, but given what you've told me about the judge, we need to prepare for the worst. Sophie observed the frantic activity with growing anxiety, her usual cheerfulness dimmed by the adult tensions surrounding her. She tugged at Morgan's sleeve while the others worked. Are we going to lose our ship, Mom? Morgan crouched to her daughter's level, finding herself without reassuring platitudes. The truth demanded acknowledgement. I don't know, sweetheart. Some very powerful people want what we found. But I promise, no matter what happens to the ship, you and I will always be together. Sophie considered this with solemn concentration. If we can't keep it all, maybe we could share. My teacher says sharing solves most problems. The innocent suggestion sparked something in Morgan's mind, a strategic pivot that had been forming in her subconscious. She turned to Catherine. What if we transform the legal battlefield entirely? Instead of fighting their ownership claims directly, what if we reposition the Aurora Star as a public trust, a floating museum dedicated to returning these artifacts to their rightful owners? The attorney's eyes narrowed in consideration. It would completely reframe the narrative. The collective wants to acquire these items privately. If we publicly commit to repatriation and educational access, they'd be fighting not just you, but the public interest. She nodded slowly. It's audacious. Their lawyers won't expect it. Elizabeth's expression reflected grudging approval. My father would have appreciated the approach. The Aurora was always meant to protect these treasures until they could safely return home. The strategy required immediate action. Catherine drafted the legal framework for the Aurora Star Maritime Heritage Foundation, while Elizabeth contacted museum professionals willing to provide institutional support. Morgan worked with local media, transforming the narrative from private treasure hunt to cultural preservation mission. Sophie contributed the most emotionally compelling element, artwork showing the Aurora Star as a treasure guardian rather than a treasure chest, complete with a child's pure perspective on why history mattered. Her drawings, shared with local news, humanized the abstract legal battle in ways that sophisticated PR could not have achieved. The emergency hearing proceeded with unexpected developments. Judge Harmon, perhaps aware of growing public scrutiny, recused himself from the case. His replacement, Judge Anita Cordero, had extensive background in cultural heritage law. The collective's legal team appeared visibly unsettled by this turn of events. Catherine presented their museum proposal with polished precision. Your Honor, my client never intended to claim ownership of these historical artifacts. From the moment of discovery, Ms. Reynolds has documented and protected these items with the sole intention of facilitating their return to legitimate owners. The proposed foundation provides a transparent, legally sound framework for achieving that goal. The collective's attorneys countered with increasingly technical arguments about maritime salvage rights in abandoned property claims. Judge Cordero listened attentively to both sides before issuing a preliminary ruling. The court finds merit in the museum approach as the most appropriate means of protecting these artifacts pending final determination of ownership claims. The Aurora Star and its contents shall remain under Ms. Reynolds' stewardship with appropriate oversight from qualified museum professionals until individual provenance can be established for each item. Morgan allowed herself a moment of cautious relief as they left the courthouse. The Aurora was temporarily secure, their stewardship legally recognized. But Sterling's expression as he watched them depart suggested the battle had merely entered a new phase. That evening, celebration aboard the Aurora was tempered by practical concerns. The museum designation brought new requirements: proper conservation conditions, security protocols, insurance considerations. The financial burden remained daunting despite donations beginning to trickle in from supporters captivated by their story. Morgan sat with Sophie on the upper deck, watching stars emerge above the harbor. The child had been uncharacteristically quiet since returning from court. "What's on your mind, sweetheart?" Sophie traced patterns on the weathered decking. "Does this mean we can keep living here? That the bad men can't take our ship away?" Before Morgan could answer, William Harrington's voice crackled over the ship's newly installed communication system. "Security breach at the stern loading dock. Multiple intruders." The night exploded into chaos. Flashlight beams cut through darkness as figures in black tactical gear moved with practiced efficiency toward the ship's central access points. Morgan scooped Sophie into her arms, racing for their designated safe room, the former purser's office, reinforced with additional locks and communication equipment. Elizabeth intercepted them in the corridor, face taut with urgency. "They've disabled the external cameras. Harbor security is responding, but they'll be minutes out." Morgan secured Sophie in the safe room, heart pounding as she engaged multiple locks. "Stay here. Don't open for anyone but me or Elizabeth. Use the emergency button if anyone tries to break in." She pressed her palm against the door after closing it, a momentary prayer for her daughter's safety before turning to face the crisis. The intruders had breached 2 entry points already. Morgan could hear the methodical progress of their search teams moving through lower decks. Professional, coordinated, heading unerringly toward the vault. This was no random break-in, but a carefully planned extraction operation. Elizabeth appeared at her side, surprisingly calm. "William has armed the fire suppression system. On my signal will trigger sectors 3 and 4. Morgan stared at the older woman, momentarily shocked by the revelation of such detailed contingency planning. "You expected this." Elizabeth's expression remained grimly focused. "The collective doesn't limit itself to legal methods when sufficient money is at stake. We've prepared accordingly." The ship's ancient pipes groaned as Elizabeth activated a sequence on her phone. Shouts of surprise echoed from below as high-pressure fire suppressant deployed in specific sections, temporarily disorienting the intruders. Harbor security sirens wailed in the distance, growing closer. One team of intruders, undeterred by the chaos, continued toward the vault. Morgan and Elizabeth intercepted them at the hidden stairwell, using their superior knowledge of the ship's layout to advantage. Elizabeth revealed unexpected resources, sophisticated jamming equipment that disrupted the intruders' communications, creating confusion in their ranks. The confrontation at the vault entrance became a battle of wits rather than force. While Elizabeth distracted the lead intruders with technical alarms and misdirection, Morgan rerouted electrical systems from her mechanic's toolkit, creating cascading power failures in strategic sections. Years of troubleshooting stubborn engines had prepared her for creative problem-solving under pressure. The intruders' advantage of numbers and equipment began to falter against the defenders' intimate knowledge of the Aurora's systems. As harbor security finally arrived, the extraction team made a tactical retreat, melting away into the darkness with professional efficiency. They left behind equipment, a dropped tactical radio, and most importantly, empty-handed. The aftermath brought police, investigators, and renewed media attention. Morgan gave statements while keeping Sophie sheltered from the case, the child finally sleeping after hours of frightened vigilance. Evidence technicians photographed boot prints and collected abandoned equipment, but Morgan harbored no illusions about law enforcement's ability to connect the intrusion to Sterling or the collective. Dawn revealed the extent of damage: broken locks, disabled security systems, forced entry points requiring immediate repair. Most disturbingly, the intruders had known exactly where to go, suggesting inside knowledge of the ship's layout, including the vault's location. Catherine arrived, summoned by Elizabeth's urgent call. The attorney surveyed the damage with clinical detachment. This strengthens our legal position. Attempted theft during ongoing litigation demonstrates bad faith on their part. We'll file additional motions immediately. Elizabeth circled back to the more immediate concern. Someone gave them detailed information about our security measures and the vault's location. We have a serious breach. Suspicion fell naturally on Dr. Alexander Chen, who had mapped the vault during authentication. Morgan defended him reluctantly. He's been publicly supportive of the museum approach. His reputation would be destroyed if he were implicated in theft. William Harrington had been conspicuously quiet during the aftermath, his weathered face unreadable as he examined the intruder's entry points. Professional work, military precision. The collective has upgraded their acquisition team. Elizabeth watched him with thinly veiled distrust. You seem remarkably familiar with their methods, William. The tension that had simmered between them erupted into open conflict. You always did prefer theoretical purity to practical solutions, Lizzie. Some of us actually get our hands dirty protecting what matters. Morgan stepped between them, patience exhausted by the night's events. If you two want to relitigate ancient history, do it elsewhere. We have a ship to secure and a child who's terrified that bad men might return at any moment. The rebuke landed effectively. Both Elizabeth and William retreated from their personal animosity, redirecting energy toward practical solutions. New security systems were installed, weak points reinforced, and volunteer guards recruited from Harrington's network of retired naval personnel. Dr. Chen arrived the following day, visibly shaken by news of the break-in. They came to my office too, tore the place apart looking for documentation on the Aurora's collection. His hands trembled slightly as he adjusted his glasses. I've received threats, subtle but unmistakable. They want the authentication records. Morgan studied him, searching for signs of deception but finding only genuine fear. Why not just give them copies? The documentation exists in multiple locations now. Chen's expression tightened. Because they specifically want my provenance research. I've identified connections between certain pieces and families who lost everything during the Holocaust. If the collective obtains that information first, they'll approach those families with lowball offers before they realize the true value or significance of their claims. The revelation added moral urgency to their already complex situation. This wasn't just about possession of valuable objects, but about justice for families who had suffered historic wrongs. Morgan felt the weight of responsibility deepening, extending beyond her immediate concerns for Sophie and the ship. Elizabeth organized the provenance research into secure digital formats, creating multiple backups stored with trusted contacts internationally. If anything happens to us, this information will automatically release to relevant cultural heritage organizations and family representatives. The legal battle intensified as the collective adjusted tactics. Rather than pursuing the entire collection, they filed specific claims against 37 items of particular cultural significance, citing obscure treaties and complex chains of custody. Each claim required individual research and response, draining resources and attention. Meanwhile, Richard Sterling launched a sophisticated public relations campaign questioning the museum's capability to properly preserve delicate historical treasures aboard a deteriorating vessel. Conservation experts associated with prestigious institutions raised technical concerns about humidity, temperature control, and structural stability. Morgan found herself defending not just legal ownership, but her technical competence to maintain proper conservation conditions. Years of precision mechanical work had not prepared her for debates about archival standards and preservation ethics. The attacks felt personal, undermining her confidence in ways that straightforward threats could not. Sophie noticed her mother's deepening stress, the child's perceptiveness cutting through adult pretenses. "You look tired like Mrs. Henderson when her arthritis hurts. Are the mean people still trying to take our treasures?" Morgan gathered her daughter close, drawing strength from the simple human connection. "They're trying different ways to make us give up. But we're not going to, right?" Sophie nodded with absolute conviction. "Never ever. This is our ship now. We're the guardians." The child's unwavering belief provided momentary respite from doubt, but practical challenges mounted relentlessly. The harbor master delivered formal notice that pier fees would increase by 300%, effective immediately, citing enhanced security requirements and administrative burdens. Their financial reserves, already stretched thin, would be exhausted within weeks. Elizabeth made calls to her network of cultural heritage advocates, securing promises of financial support that remained frustratingly intangible. Funds are being arranged, but institutional bureaucracy moves slowly. "We need more immediate solutions." Daughter Chen proposed a controversial approach: selective deaccessioning of items with clear, uncontested provenance and minimal historical significance. "We could raise operating funds by properly selling a few pieces through legitimate auction houses, with full transparency about provenance and purpose." The suggestion created immediate division among their advisors. Catherine Walsh raised legal concerns about selling any items before final ownership determination. Elizabeth objected on ethical grounds, arguing that once they began treating the collection as a financial asset, they surrendered the moral high ground. Morgan found herself in the uncomfortable position of final decision-maker, weighing practical necessities against principle. The Aurora Star itself required urgent repairs to remain seaworthy and habitable. Conservation equipment needed for proper artifact preservation remained beyond their budget. Sophie needed stability, security, education. The harbor master's deadline for increased fees loomed when Elizabeth entered the captain's lounge with unexpected news. "Jonathan and Miriam Goldstein are here. They've traveled from Boston regarding items that may have belonged to their family." The elderly couple who followed Elizabeth moved with the careful dignity of those who carry both physical fragility and immense personal history. Miriam Goldstein's eyes immediately found the silver Kiddush cup displayed in a makeshift exhibition case, one of the items Dr. Chen had authenticated as likely belonging to a prominent Jewish family from Vienna. The moment transcended legal complexities and financial pressures. Miriam approached the case slowly, one hand pressed against her chest. "My grandfather's. I recognized the engraving on the base, his wedding date, and my grandmother's initials. I was 7 when they packed everything away for safekeeping before we fled." Jonathan supported his wife's elbow as she swayed slightly. "We never expected to see any of it again. Family legend said everything was lost when the Nazis confiscated Jewish property. How did it come to be here?" Morgan watched Sophie observe the couple with solemn attention. The child moved closer to Miriam, looking up with guileless curiosity. "Did you have to leave your home when you were little like me?" The simple question opened floodgates of story and memory. Miriam described a childhood interrupted by persecution, precious possessions entrusted to non-Jewish friends, midnight escapes, and the decades-long shadow of loss. Sophie listened with complete absorption, occasionally asking questions that adults might have considered too direct, but that Miriam answered with gentle honesty. When the formal identification process concluded, Morgan made an immediate decision that bypassed committees and legal consultation. She carefully wrapped the Kiddush cup and matching candlesticks in archival material, then placed them in Miriam's hands. "These belong with your family. No applications, no waiting periods, no bureaucracy." Catherine Walsh, witnessing the exchange, offered no legal objections despite the technical complications it created. Some principles transcended procedural correctness. The Goldsteins departed with tangible pieces of their family history restored, promising to document the item's story for the museum's archives. The experience crystallized Morgan's understanding of the Aurora's true purpose. This wasn't about possession or preservation for abstract posterity. It was about reconnection, returning cultural heritage to the human stories from which it had been violently separated. She gathered her core advisors that evening, Sophie asleep in the corner armchair after the emotionally intense day. We need to shift our approach. Instead of becoming a traditional museum focused on exhibiting these artifacts, we should actively work to reunite them with families and communities. A repatriation center rather than a collection. Dr. Chen immediately grasped the implications. That fundamentally changes our conservation priorities and exhibition approach. Everything becomes temporary, transitional. Elizabeth nodded slowly, approval warming her typically reserved expression. My father would have considered it the fulfillment of his original mission. The Aurora was never meant to be a permanent repository, just a sanctuary until safe return became possible. The strategic pivot energized their team and transformed public perception. Local media covered the Goldstein story, emphasizing the human dimension of cultural repatriation. Donations increased as people connected emotionally with the mission. Several maritime preservation organizations offered technical assistance with the ship's structural needs. The collective's response came swiftly and with unexpected viciousness. Conrad Wells, their legal representative, filed emergency motions alleging improper disposal of contested artifacts, demanding immediate court-appointed receivership of the entire collection. Simultaneously, anonymous online attacks questioned the Goldstein's claim, suggesting the emotional reunion had been staged for publicity. Most disturbingly, Sophie returned from a rare school day visibly upset. Her teacher had shown students a news segment about controversial artifacts aboard the Aurora Star, including expert commentary suggesting the entire collection might be fraudulent. Classmates had teased her mercilessly about living in a fake treasure ship. Morgan comforted her daughter while rage simmered beneath her calm exterior. The collective had crossed a line, weaponizing a child's social environment. Some people are afraid of what we're doing because it challenges how they make money from art and history. They're trying to make us feel small because our idea is actually very big and important. Sophie wiped tears with determined fingers. Then we need to make our idea even bigger so everyone can see it. The child's resilience inspired a bolder approach. Rather than defending against the collective's legal and public relations assaults, they would expand their mission dramatically. Catherine drafted plans for a traveling exhibition program that would bring artifacts to communities worldwide during the repatriation process. Elizabeth activated international contacts to arrange port visits in countries with significant diaspora populations connected to the collection. Most ambitiously, Morgan revisited the Aurora Star's original purpose: mobility. What if we restore the engines, make her seaworthy again? Instead of fighting to stay at this pier, we could literally take our mission around the world, beyond the collective's local influence. The concept was audacious, bordering on impossible. The Aurora's engines had been dormant for over a decade. Restoration would require specialized parts, expertise, and extraordinary expense. Yet the strategic advantages were compelling, removing jurisdictional leverage from the collective while literally and figuratively expanding their mission's reach. William Harrington, initially skeptical, gradually warmed to the plan's tactical merits. Sterling's operation is optimized for stationary targets. They've invested heavily in this specific legal jurisdiction and harbor authority. Mobility disrupts their entire strategy. The court date for the collective's receivership demand approached with ominous speed. Catherine prepared their defense while Morgan redirected all available resources toward essential engine repairs. Sophie created a countdown calendar for their planned departure, decorating it with colorful drawings of ocean waves and distant harbors. 3 days before the hearing, Richard Sterling made his final move. The harbor master arrived with formal notice. The entire pier had been sold to Meridian Development Corporation, another collective shell company. All existing lease agreements were terminated effective immediately. The Aurora Star had 48 hours to vacate its berth. Elizabeth received the news with unexpected calm. They've overplayed their hand, forcing us out before the court hearing undermines their legal position. It appears punitive rather than protective of the artifacts. Catherine agreed, immediately filing for emergency relief and documenting the obvious connection between the collective's court action and the pier purchase. Judge Cordero scheduled an immediate hearing, clearly troubled by the timing. The legal victory proved bittersweet. The judge granted a temporary restraining order preventing their eviction before proper court proceedings, but separately allowed limited inspection of the collection by court-appointed experts to assess conservation conditions. The collective had achieved their primary objective, official access to the vault and its contents. Morgan worked through the night, ensuring every item was thoroughly documented before the inspection team arrived. Sophie helped organize the photographic evidence, creating a system of colored stickers that matched digital records. This way we'll know if they move anything or try to take something, she explained with childlike pragmatism. The inspection team arrived at dawn, 3 conservators with impressive credentials and clear connections to institutions funded by the collective. Their assessment was predictably critical, emphasizing humidity fluctuations, inadequate security, and potential structural issues with the ship itself. The report would provide powerful ammunition for the receivership hearing. What the collective hadn't anticipated was Morgan's mechanical ingenuity. While their experts documented conservation deficiencies, she had been systematically addressing the Aurora's propulsion systems. William Harrington's naval contacts provided access to specialized parts. Elizabeth's network included retired engineers with experience on similar vessels. The impossible timeline for restoration contracted through round-the-clock effort and creative problem-solving. The morning of the court hearing dawned with unexpected developments. As Morgan prepared to leave for the courthouse, harbor authorities reported a potential environmental emergency, smoke visible from the Aurora's exhaust stacks, possible fuel leakage. The ship had been ordered to activate pumping systems to prevent contamination. Sterling arrived at the courthouse to find Catherine Walsh requesting a brief delay. "My client is addressing an urgent environmental compliance issue at the harbor. The harbor master has confirmed the situation." Judge Cordero granted a 2-hour postponement, unaware of the actual circumstances unfolding at Pier 17. The environmental emergency was carefully orchestrated cover for engine testing. Black smoke billowed dramatically from the Aurora's stacks, expected during initial firing of long-dormant diesel engines. Harbor authorities, sympathetic to Morgan's mission after the collective's heavy-handed pier purchase, played their part in the deception. Morgan stood in the engine room, hands steady on controls that hadn't been operated in over a decade. William monitored pressure gauges while Elizabeth coordinated with the harbor pilots via radio. The massive engines coughed, protested, then settled into a deepening rhythm that vibrated through the ship's bones. Sophie watched wide-eyed from a safe observation position, feeling the deck rumble beneath her feet. "The Aurora is waking up. She wants to sail again." The court hearing proceeded with unexpected developments. Judge Cordero, reviewing the inspection report and the collective's arguments for receivership, appeared troubled by evidence of coordinated legal and financial pressure tactics. The court is concerned about the appearance of manufactured circumstances designed to force a particular outcome. Richard Sterling maintained professional composure despite growing awareness that events at the harbor might be unfolding beyond his control. His legal team emphasized conservation standards and technical requirements that the Aurora Star allegedly failed to meet. Catherine countered with their museum accreditation progress, partnership agreements with established institutions, and most effectively, documented cases of successful repatriation, like the Goldstein family's artifacts. The Aurora Star Maritime Heritage Foundation has already accomplished more meaningful cultural preservation in weeks than many traditional institutions achieve in years. The judge appeared to be weighing arguments carefully when her clerk delivered an urgent message. She read it with raised eyebrows before addressing the court. "I've just been informed that the vessel in question is currently underway. Would either party care to explain?" Sterling's face registered genuine shock as Catherine maintained professional neutrality. "Your Honor, my client informed me of necessary engine testing this morning. I was not aware that the testing would include actual movement from the berth." The Aurora Star, decades of inertia finally broken, moved with ponderous dignity away from Pier 17. Harbor tugs provided guidance rather than primary propulsion. The ship's own engines drove it forward into open water for the first time in years. Morgan stood on the bridge, hands gripping the wheel with white-knuckle intensity, following William's navigational guidance. Sophie danced along the observation deck, waving enthusiastically at news helicopters that had appeared overhead, drawn by the spectacular sight of the treasure ship suddenly mobile. Elizabeth coordinated with maritime authorities, ensuring their unorthodox departure remained technically legal despite its dramatic timing. At the courthouse, proceedings dissolved into procedural chaos. Sterling's team demanded immediate injunctions, vessel seizure, and contempt charges. Judge Cordero, visibly struggling to maintain courtroom decorum, finally broke through the legal arguments with decisive authority. The court cannot issue orders regarding current maritime operations without proper maritime jurisdiction. This proceeding is adjourned until jurisdictional questions can be properly addressed. The Aurora Star reached the designated anchorage point by mid-afternoon, still within the harbor's outer boundaries but beyond the jurisdiction of the pier's new owners. Morgan cut engines with trembling hands, the magnitude of what they'd accomplished settling over her like a physical weight. They had transformed a static legal battlefield into three-dimensional chess, changing not just tactics, but the nature of the game itself. Elizabeth joined her on the bridge, rare approval softening her typically guarded expression. My father would be proud. The Aurora was built to move, to carry precious cargo safely between worlds. Today she remembered her purpose. Sophie burst onto the bridge, breathless with excitement. Mom, people in boats are coming to see us, hundreds of them, and they're all waving and cheering. Indeed, the harbor had erupted with spontaneous support. Small crafts surrounded the Aurora Star at respectful distances, their occupants waving encouragement. Local newsboats circled with cameras, capturing the historic moment. The narrative had transformed completely, no longer about legal technicalities, but about a defiant ship risen from neglect to continue its mission of cultural protection. Morgan lifted Sophie onto a chair for a better view of the impromptu flotilla. See that? All those people understand what we're doing. They're helping us protect the treasures until they can go home. As sunset painted the water in amber and gold, Morgan stood on the upper deck with her daughter, watching their unlikely support fleet disperse for evening. The Aurora Star rocked gently at anchor, its massive form somehow more alive now that it had proven capable of movement. The breeze carried away the day's tension, replacing it with cautious hope. Sophie leaned against the railing, small face solemn with a child's perception of momentous events. The ship was sad when it was stuck at the pier. Now it's happy because it can go places again. Morgan brushed hair from her daughter's forehead, struck by the simple wisdom. I think you're right. Some things aren't meant to stay in one place forever. They need to move to find where they truly belong. The Aurora Star floated free, suspended between sea and sky, past and future. The battle with the collective had entered a new phase, but for this moment, they had reclaimed the power of movement, both literally and figuratively. Whatever came next, they would face it not as trapped defenders, but as navigators charting their own course. Anchored beyond the harbor's commercial piers, the Aurora Star transformed from besieged sanctuary to floating embassy of cultural heritage. 6 months after their dramatic departure from Pier 17, Morgan had established a functioning system that balanced restoration work, artifact preservation, and their expanding repatriation mission. The ship's position, technically within harbor limits, but outside any single property owner's jurisdiction, created a legal stalemate that frustrated the collective's attempts at seizure. Dawnlight filtered through newly repaired portholes in what had become the Aurora's primary exhibition space. The former Grand Ballroom now housed carefully designed display cases, conservation workstations, and interactive historical exhibits. Restoration experts, funded by grants from cultural preservation organizations impressed by their mission, had stabilized the ship's most critical systems. The Aurora wasn't luxurious, but it was functional, seaworthy, and increasingly recognized as a legitimate cultural institution. Morgan adjusted the temperature controls for a display of delicate textiles, movements precise after months of specialized conservation training. The technical knowledge that had once been focused on engines and mechanical systems now extended to humidity levels, light exposure limitations, and archival preservation techniques. She'd become an unlikely hybrid, mechanic and museum director, preservation specialist, and ship captain. Sophie skipped into the exhibition space, proudly wearing her junior curator badge. Now 9 years old, she'd adapted to their unconventional life with remarkable resilience. Local families transported her to shore for school each morning via a rotating volunteer boat service, and her afternoons were spent helping with age-appropriate museum tasks. Far from suffering from their unusual living situation, she had flourished, developing an encyclopedic knowledge of art history that regularly astonish visitors. Catherine Walsh arrived on the morning supply boat, carrying legal documents and freshly brewed coffee, two essential resources for their ongoing operation. The National Maritime Heritage Foundation approved your grant application, full funding for the engine restoration project. Morgan accepted both coffee and news with equal gratitude. The engines, while functional enough for their harbor escape, required substantial work before the Aurora could undertake longer voyages. That solves our immediate technical challenges. What about the jurisdictional appeals? Catherine's expression tightened slightly. Mixed results. Judge Cordero's ruling stands. The collective can't force you back to Pier 17 or any specific location. But they've filed in federal court challenging your right to establish what they're calling a sovereign floating museum without proper customs clearance for international artifacts. This legal chess match had continued relentlessly, with the collective shifting strategies from direct seizure attempts to bureaucratic entanglement. Each week brought new regulatory challenges, inspection demands, and technical objections. Sterling had assembled a team of specialists whose sole purpose seemed to be finding arcane regulations that might apply to their unique situation. Elizabeth entered from the conservation lab, immediately sensing the tension. More legal complications? Morgan nodded, studying the technical specifications for the engine restoration. They're trying to classify us as an international import/export operation rather than a domestic cultural institution. Different jurisdiction, different rules. Elizabeth absorbed this with characteristic composure. Predictable, the collective excels at forum shopping, finding legal venues favorable to their interests. She turned to Catherine. Have they made any progress locating Claire Beaumont? Claire Beaumont, the missing piece in their understanding of the collective's operation. William Harrington had identified her as the collective's primary authenticator, responsible for creating documentation that transformed questionably acquired artifacts into seemingly legitimate art market commodities. Finding her could potentially expose the entire organization's methods. Catherine shook her head. She's disappeared completely. Last known location was Geneva 3 months ago. Our investigators believe she may have been relocated after your blog about the collective's authentication methods went viral. Morgan's public education campaign about the collective's operations had gained unexpected traction in art world circles. By publishing detailed analyses of their methods, without directly accusing specific individuals, she had created awareness that complicated their usual acquisition strategies. Sterling's organization now operated under an uncomfortable scrutiny from legitimate museums and cultural institutions. The radio crackled with harbor traffic notifications. William Harrington's voice broke through, unusually urgent. Morgan, incoming situation. Sterling's marine operations team just chartered the high-speed tender Osprey. 4 men boarded with equipment cases. ETA to your position, approximately 15 minutes. Morgan immediately shifted to security protocols developed over months of potential threats. Sophie, museum lockdown procedure. You know where to go. The child nodded with practiced seriousness, immediately heading to their designated secure area, the former radio room, reinforced and stocked with emergency supplies. Elizabeth activated their alert system, notifying harbor authorities and documentation teams monitoring their situation. Catherine gathered critical legal documents into waterproof containers. Years of defending the Aurora had created efficient emergency responses that engaged automatically at the first sign of potential threat. Morgan moved to the bridge, adjusting binoculars to scan the harbor. The sleek form of the Osprey cut through morning waters with purpose, heading directly toward their anchorage. Not an inspection vessel or official harbor craft, but a private charter with no clear legitimate business approaching an anchored museum ship. William's boat approached from the opposite direction, positioning between the oncoming vessel and the Aurora. His retired naval officer's authority carried weight with Harbor Patrol, who had dispatched an observation craft but not yet direct intervention. The Osprey slowed as it neared their position, maintaining just outside the security perimeter buoys Morgan had established around the Aurora. 4 men in business casual attire stood on deck, scanning the ship with professional assessment. One raised a bullhorn. Aurora Star, this is Jonathan Wells, representing Meridian Cultural Preservation. We're serving notice of intent to inspect under Maritime Salvage Regulation 47B concerning historically significant cargo carried on vessels in U.S. waters. Catherine stepped onto the deck beside Morgan. immediately recognizing the legal strategy. They're trying a new approach, claiming rights under historical salvage laws rather than ownership. It's creative, I'll give them that. William's vessel maintained position between the Osprey and the Aurora, creating a physical barrier while Catherine used their communication system to respond. Meridian representatives, the Aurora Star is a registered cultural institution with scheduled inspection protocols. Unannounced boarding attempts violate the standing injunction issued by Judge Cordero. Harbor Patrol has been notified of your unauthorized approach. The standoff continued for nearly an hour, the collective's team maintaining position while continuously photographing the Aurora from all angles, documenting every detail visible from their vantage point. Harbor Patrol finally arrived, instructing the Osprey to maintain greater distance from the anchored vessel. They departed with obvious reluctance, but Morgan harbored no illusions about the encounter's purpose. Catherine confirmed her suspicions. They're documenting our current security measures, looking for vulnerabilities. The inspection claim was pretext. They never expected to actually board. Elizabeth studied the photographs they'd taken of the departing vessel. The equipment cases match specialized scanning technology, ground-penetrating radar, and thermal imaging. They're mapping the Aurora's structure, likely looking for access points we haven't secured. The incident reinforced what Morgan had known for months. Their stationary position, while temporarily effective, created inevitable vulnerability. The Aurora needed to fulfill its original purpose: movement. The Maritime Heritage Grant had arrived at the perfect moment, enabling the final phase of engine restoration that would transform them from anchored target to mobile museum. Over the following weeks, specialists arrived daily to work on the massive diesel engines. Morgan divided her time between supervising the technical resurrection of the ship's propulsion systems and continuing their primary mission of cultural repatriation. Each successful return of artifacts to descendants or cultural institutions strengthened their reputation and purpose. Sophie thrived amid the controlled chaos, absorbing knowledge from the rotating cast of experts aboard the Aurora. She developed particularly close bonds with the engine restoration team, often appearing in the engine room with carefully labeled tools and surprisingly insightful questions about mechanical systems. One elderly engineer, charmed by her earnest curiosity, taught her the basics of diesel engine timing. "You've got mechanic's hands, like your mother, steady and precise. Good instincts for machinery." Sophie beamed with pride, carefully adjusting a small timing tool under supervision. "Mom says machines make sense when you listen to them. People are harder because they don't always say what's wrong." The preparation for mobility accelerated when harbor authorities notified them of upcoming dredging operations that would require the Aurora to temporarily relocate. The coincidental timing provided perfect cover for their long-planned departure from Clearwater Bay to a series of coastal museum partnerships they'd arranged along the eastern seaboard. Elizabeth coordinated with maritime museums in 4 cities that had agreed to host the Aurora as a visiting exhibition. Catherine finalized permissions and transit documentation to ensure their operation remained unassailable from legal challenges. William recruited experienced crew members from his naval contacts to supplement Morgan's developing captaining skills. 3 days before their scheduled departure, Dr. Alexander Chen arrived with troubling information. Sterling's been meeting with customs officials. They're preparing to classify certain artifacts aboard as restricted items requiring special export licensing, even for coastal transit between U.S. ports. The strategy was clear: create regulatory entanglements that would prevent the Aurora from leaving its current position, where the collective could continue methodical pressure. Morgan gathered her core advisors in the captain's lounge, now serving as their strategic planning center. Catherine outlined the legal implications. They're exploiting a technical distinction between fixed museum locations and mobile exhibitions. Different regulatory frameworks apply once we're actively transiting between ports. Elizabeth studied navigation charts spread across the table. If we wait for official clarification, we'll be trapped in bureaucratic limbo indefinitely. That's precisely their strategy. The unspoken question hung in the air: whether to proceed with their departure despite potential regulatory complications. The decision balanced legal risk against the practical reality that remaining stationary made them increasingly vulnerable to the collective's methodical encirclement. Morgan traced their planned route along coastal waters, mind calculating fuel consumption, port clearances, and security considerations. We've established legitimate museum partnerships at each destination. Our artifacts are properly documented. We're not exporting anything from U.S. territory. She looked up, decision crystallizing. We maintain our original departure schedule. The final days of preparation intensified as word spread through harbor networks about the Aurora's imminent departure. Local supporters organized a flotilla farewell. Small craft would accompany them to the harbor entrance in a visible demonstration of community support. News outlets requested permission to document the historic voyage of the floating museum that had captured public imagination. Beneath this celebratory atmosphere, Morgan implemented additional security precautions. The collective had invested too heavily in preventing their departure to simply accept defeat. William established overnight patrols around the Aurora's perimeter. Elizabeth secured their most sensitive documentation and irreplaceable artifacts in specialized containers designed to withstand water damage or rough handling. The morning of departure dawned clear and calm, perfect conditions for navigating the complex harbor channels. Morgan stood on the bridge, reviewing final systems checks with methodical precision. Sophie bounced between the observation positions, vibrating with excitement at the adventure ahead. The Aurora's engines rumbled to life with newfound confidence after months of painstaking restoration. Harbor tugs arrived to assist their initial navigation through crowded waters. Small craft appeared from all directions, a spontaneous honor guard for their departure. Local news helicopters circled overhead, capturing the moment for evening broadcasts. As they prepared to weigh anchor, William's urgent voice crackled over the communication system. Morgan, incoming harbor police vessel approaching rapidly from Eastern Channel. They're requesting immediate boarding for inspection. Catherine, reviewing their departure documentation nearby, immediately recognized the delaying tactic. Customs officials conveniently appearing minutes before scheduled departure? Sterling's regulatory strategy in action. Morgan assessed options with the rapid calculation of someone who had spent months preparing for multiple contingencies. Direct refusal would create legal complications that could indefinitely delay their mission. Compliance would mean surrendering their carefully planned departure timeline, potentially trapping them in regulatory quicksand. Elizabeth joined them on the bridge, expression grave. Harbor Control confirms the vessel is officially registered to Port Authority. They have technical jurisdiction to request inspection. Morgan made her decision, directing the communication officer to respond. Aurora Star acknowledges inspection request. We are currently executing departure procedures with tugs engaged. For safety reasons, we'll proceed to open water with harbor navigation assistance, then heave to at marker buoy 7 for inspection before continuing our journey. The strategic compromise maintained their departure momentum while technically complying with inspection requirements. The officials would still board, but on the Aurora's timeline and beyond the confusing jurisdictional boundaries of the inner harbor. As the massive ship began moving through the channel, escorted by tugs and surrounded by supportive smaller craft, Morgan spotted Sterling himself on a private vessel observing their departure. Even at a distance, his expression conveyed cold calculation rather than defeat. The Aurora's escape from physical constraint represented a tactical setback, not the end of his pursuit. The inspection itself proceeded with predictable obstruction, officials meticulously examining documentation for hours, photographing artifacts, questioning conservation methods. Catherine managed the process with practiced diplomatic skill, maintaining technical compliance while preventing access to sensitive areas. By late afternoon, they had completed their performance of authority without identifying actionable violations. As the inspection vessel finally departed, Morgan gave the command to resume their journey. The Aurora's engines deepened their rhythm, pushing the massive vessel forward with gathering momentum. Sophie stood beside her mother on the bridge, watching the familiar shoreline of Clearwater Bay recede behind them. "We're really doing it," the child whispered, awe coloring her voice. "The Aurora's sailing again." Morgan felt the ship respond beneath her hands, decades of maritime engineering knowledge merging with her mechanical intuition. The vessel that had become their home, their mission, and their purpose was fulfilling its original design, carrying precious cargo safely between worlds. The coastal journey proceeded without significant incident. each day increasing the distance between the Aurora and the collective's primary sphere of influence. Their first port of call, Charleston's Maritime Museum, welcomed them with ceremonial water cannons and crowds of visitors eager to tour the famous treasure ship that had captured national attention. The exhibition partnership proved mutually beneficial. The host museum provided shore facilities and additional security, while the Aurora's unique collection and compelling story drew record attendance. Local families brought children to hear Sophie's enthusiastic guided tours, her perspective resonating particularly with young visitors who saw the artifacts through her eyes, not as valuable objects, but as pieces of human stories interrupted by history's chaos. Morgan observed her daughter's natural talent for storytelling with pride tinged by reflection. Their unconventional life had denied Sophie normal childhood experiences, but granted her extraordinary ones instead. The once shy child had blossomed into a confident ambassador for their mission, forming connections with people of all ages through her authentic passion for the artifacts and their histories. Their Charleston exhibition concluded with a repatriation ceremony that embodied their mission's purpose. A collection of religious manuscripts, originally from a monastery in Eastern Europe, was formally transferred to representatives of the cultural institution that had continued the monastery's scholarly tradition after political upheaval forced relocation. The emotional handover, witnessed by hundreds of visitors, transformed abstract concepts of cultural heritage into tangible human connection. The elderly scholar who accepted the manuscripts with trembling hands spoke of generations who had preserved oral traditions while believing the written records lost forever. Some treasures carry not just beauty or monetary value, but the very identity of a people. In returning these pages, you restore a missing piece of our collective memory. As the Aurora prepared to depart for their next destination, Morgan received notification of escalating legal maneuvers from the collective. Sterling had filed federal complaints alleging improper transport of culturally protected items across state lines, technical violations of maritime museum regulations, and questionable provenance documentation. Catherine assessed the filings with professional detachment. They're throwing everything at the wall to see what sticks. Most of these claims won't survive preliminary hearings, but they'll drain resources and create administrative burdens at each port. The pattern continued at subsequent exhibitions in Norfolk and Baltimore. Enthusiastic public reception counterbalanced by increasingly creative regulatory challenges. Local officials, clearly influenced by behind-the-scenes pressure, appeared with clipboard and citation books, identifying technical violations of municipal codes never previously applied to visiting exhibition vessels. Elizabeth managed these challenges with diplomatic skill, honed through decades of cultural heritage work. This is standard procedure for the collective, death by 1,000 bureaucratic cuts. They're attempting to make our operation so administratively burdensome that surrender becomes attractive. Despite these obstacles, the Aurora's mobile museum concept proved remarkably successful. Each port visit strengthened their network of institutional support and public goodwill. More importantly, their primary mission, repatriation of artifacts to rightful owners or appropriate cultural institutions, accelerated as their visibility increased. Families and organizations with connections to the collection could now find them, rather than Morgan having to trace complex historical lineages. As they approached New York Harbor for their most ambitious exhibition to date, Morgan received unexpected information from one of Williams' intelligence contacts. Richard Sterling had purchased a controlling interest in the Hudson River Marina, where they were scheduled to dock, the fourth property acquisition directly connected to their planned route. The pattern revealed the collective's evolving strategy. Unable to legally seize the Aurora or its contents, they were systematically purchasing key infrastructure along their exhibition path. Each property acquisition expanded Sterling's ability to create operational obstacles through selective enforcement of docking regulations, service denials, and controlled access to necessary maritime services. Morgan gathered her advisory team in the captain's lounge. Maps of alternative docking locations spread across the table. They're trying to control our access to port facilities. If this pattern continues, we'll eventually run out of friendly harbors. William traced potential alternate routes with a weathered finger. There are smaller facilities, independent operators not yet compromised. but they lack the security, infrastructure, and visitor capacity we need for proper exhibitions. Elizabeth studied property ownership records on her laptop. Sterling's acquisition team is moving faster than we anticipated. They've approached owners of 3 additional facilities along our planned route. The immediate tactical problem, where to dock in New York, required creative solution. After considering limited options, Morgan proposed an unconventional approach. What if we don't dock at all? We anchor in the harbor and use tender vessels to transport visitors and staff. The Harbor Authority controls anchorage permits, not private marina owners. The logistical challenges were substantial, but not insurmountable. Catherine confirmed the regulatory feasibility while William arranged for appropriate tender vessels through his maritime contacts. Elizabeth coordinated with partner museums to adjust exhibition schedules and visitor management plans. Their arrival in New York Harbor created the intended media spectacle. The Aurora star silhouetted against the Manhattan skyline, spotlights illuminating her restored grandeur. Sterling's marina acquisition became irrelevant as visitors eagerly boarded small craft for the unique experience of touring a museum ship at anchor in the harbor. The exhibition's success exceeded expectations, with waiting lists forming for available touring slots. New York's sophisticated art community embraced the Aurora's mission with particular enthusiasm. Curators from major museums offered conservation assistance, scholars volunteered authentication expertise, and wealthy patrons made substantial donations to support their repatriation work. Morgan monitored these developments with cautious optimism. The collective strategy of infrastructure control had been temporarily outmaneuvered, but Sterling's resources and determination remained formidable. Each tactical victory revealed his organization's remarkable adaptability. They learned from failures and adjusted approaches with corporate efficiency. 3 weeks into their New York exhibition, the awaited countermove arrived. Sterling filed an emergency injunction claiming the Aurora's anchorage created navigational hazards and environmental risks in the busy harbor. Simultaneously, anonymous but technically credible complaints about improper waste management appeared in regulatory offices, triggering mandatory inspections. Catherine managed the legal response while Morgan addressed the environmental accusations with characteristic thoroughness. The Aurora systems exceeded regulatory requirements, with specialized modifications she had personally designed and implemented. The inspections revealed no violations, and the injunction was denied based on Harbor Authority testimony about proper positioning and navigation protocols. The victory felt hollow as Morgan recognized the emerging pattern. Each location brought new, location-specific challenges carefully crafted to exploit local regulations. The collective strategy had evolved from attempting direct acquisition to a war of administrative attrition. They were creating a regulatory gauntlet that drained resources, divided attention, and complicated their primary mission. During a rare quiet moment on the observation deck, Morgan watched the lights of Manhattan reflecting across harbor waters. Sophie leaned against the railing beside her, unusually contemplative for a child normally bubbling with energy. "Mom, are the bad people ever going to stop chasing us?" The question carried the weight of understanding beyond her years. Morgan considered sugarcoating the truth, then recognized her daughter deserved honesty. "People like Sterling don't stop, sweetheart. They just change tactics when blocked. But that doesn't mean they win." Sophie absorbed this with solemn consideration. "It's like our engine room training. When one system fails, you switch to backup systems. We just need more backup plans than they have attacks." The simple wisdom crystallized Morgan's evolving strategy. They had been reactive, responding to each of Sterling's moves with tactical adjustments. To truly secure their mission, they needed to fundamentally change the nature of the conflict by removing the Aurora from the collective sphere of influence entirely. The next morning, Morgan proposed the audacious next phase to her advisors. "We've proven the mobile museum concept works in coastal waters. What if we expand internationally? Partner with maritime museums globally, beyond any single regulatory framework that Sterling can manipulate?" The proposal created immediate division among her advisors. Catherine raised legitimate concerns about international maritime regulations, customs requirements, and jurisdictional complexities. William focused on practical challenges of open ocean transit for a vessel of the Aurora's age and design. Elizabeth alone seemed intrigued by the strategic implications. International waters create different legal frameworks. The collective's expertise is primarily in manipulating U.S. regulatory systems and property acquisitions. They're not equipped for truly global operations. She studied navigation charts thoughtfully. Transatlantic crossing would be ambitious, but not unprecedented for a vessel of this class. The debate continued for days, technical assessments balanced against strategic considerations. The Aurora's engines had performed admirably in coastal waters, but ocean crossing represented an entirely different challenge. Additional restoration, safety upgrades, and crew training would be required before such a journey could be responsibly undertaken. The decision timeline accelerated when Sterling's latest strategy became clear. Anonymous tips to customs officials raised questions about the provenance documentation of specific artifacts, triggering an investigation that could potentially freeze the entire collection pending resolution. Elizabeth recognized the approach immediately. This is textbook collective methodology. Create regulatory entanglement that immobilizes contested collections while negotiating reasonable settlements behind the scenes. She studied the list of questioned items. They've targeted pieces with legitimately complex provenance, items from regions with changing borders, governments in exile, contested territorial claims. The investigation would proceed regardless of their decision, but international partnerships could potentially provide diplomatic and institutional protection beyond Sterling's typical sphere of influence. Morgan initiated preparations for ocean crossing while Catherine managed the customs investigation, providing exhaustive documentation for each questioned artifact. As technical preparations advanced, Morgan received unexpected information from Dr. Chen's authentication network. Claire Beaumont, the collective's elusive authentication specialist, had resurfaced in London, apparently establishing new professional credentials at a prestigious auction house. This development offered potential opportunity to understand and potentially expose the collective's operational methods. The convergence of threat and opportunity crystallized Morgan's decision. Their next exhibition would be at the Maritime Museum of Southampton, England, a prestigious institution that had extended partnership invitation months earlier. The transatlantic crossing would require significant preparation, but offered strategic advantages that outweighed the technical challenges. The announcement of their international expansion generated expected reactions. Partner museums expressed enthusiasm for the expanded mission. Maritime authorities initiated technical inspections to ensure seaworthiness for ocean crossing. The collective accelerated regulatory challenges, attempting to create sufficient entanglements to prevent departure. As preparations intensified, Morgan focused on the Aurora's propulsion and navigation systems with obsessive attention to detail. The massive engines had performed reliably in coastal waters, but ocean crossing demanded different operational parameters. Additional fuel capacity, redundant systems, and specialized safety equipment required installation and testing. Sophie absorbed the controlled frenzy with characteristic adaptability, turning preparation activities into educational opportunities. She created detailed lists of safety equipment, memorized emergency protocols, and studied navigation charts with serious concentration. Her resilience continued to astonish Morgan. The child seemed to thrive on challenges that would overwhelm many adults. One evening, as they reviewed ocean weather patterns together, Sophie asked the question that had clearly been forming in her mind. "Are we running away, Mom, by going across the ocean?" Morgan considered the complex implications behind the simple question. Not running away, moving towards something better. Sometimes the smartest path forward isn't fighting every battle on someone else's terms. Sophie nodded with surprising understanding. Like chess, sometimes you move pieces away to make them stronger later. 3 weeks before their scheduled departure, Sterling executed his most aggressive move yet. The collective filed a comprehensive legal action consolidating all outstanding claims against the Aurora and its contents, requesting court-appointed receivership pending full ownership determination. Simultaneously, they petitioned for an emergency injunction, preventing the vessel from leaving U.S. territorial waters until resolution. Catherine assessed the legal maneuver with professional concern. They've combined everything into a single action before a potentially sympathetic judge. The timing is clearly designed to prevent international departure. The emergency hearing proceeded with troubling developments. Judge Raymond Harston, recently appointed to the federal bench and unfamiliar with the Aurora's complex history, appeared receptive to the collective's arguments about preservation risks during ocean transit. His preliminary comments suggested inclination to grant the injunction pending full hearing of ownership claims. During a recess, Catherine outlined their diminishing options. If Harston grants the injunction, we're effectively trapped in U.S. waters indefinitely. The full ownership case could take years to resolve. Morgan processed this assessment with mechanical precision, analyzing components of their predicament as she would a complex engine failure. The legal system had become the collective's most effective weapon, not for winning outright, but for creating paralyzing stalemate. When court resumed, Morgan authorized Catherine to propose an unprecedented compromise. The Aurora would proceed with its international exhibition schedule, but with court-appointed observers aboard to ensure artifact safety and proper conservation during transit. Most significantly, they would post a substantial performance bond, essentially financial guarantee, covering the potential value of items under ownership dispute. The proposal cleverly shifted the equation from abstract cultural value to concrete financial security. If damage occurred or items disappeared, monetary compensation was guaranteed. Judge Harston, clearly seeking middle ground between competing claims, found the approach reasonable. He denied the absolute injunction but imposed the observer requirement and bond obligation. The ruling created immediate practical challenges. The performance bond would consume nearly all their financial reserves, leaving minimal contingency funds for the journey ahead. Court-appointed observers meant constant scrutiny of their operations, creating additional administrative burden. As they prepared for departure under these new constraints, Morgan received troubling information from Williams' security network. The observers appointed by the court had connections to maritime insurance entities partially owned by Sterling's investment group. While technically independent, their objectivity was highly questionable. Elizabeth processed this development with characteristic strategic calculation. They couldn't prevent our departure, so they've embedded agents to monitor our operations and potentially influence our course. Classic infiltration tactic. The court-appointed observers, Davis and Reyes, arrived 2 days before scheduled departure, presenting credentials with professional courtesy that masked their likely divided loyalties. Morgan assigned them comfortable but strategically isolated accommodations, with access to required areas but limited exposure to sensitive operations. Final preparations accelerated despite the unwelcome oversight. Fuel bunkers filled to capacity. Navigation systems underwent comprehensive testing. Safety equipment received final certification. The Aurora Star was mechanically and legally prepared for transatlantic crossing, though uncertainties shadowed their ambitious next phase. The morning of departure dawned with perfect conditions: clear visibility, moderate winds, optimal tidal flow. Morgan stood on the bridge, completing final systems checks with practiced efficiency. Sophie observed from her designated position, excitement visible despite her attempt at serious professionalism. Harbor tugs arrived to assist their initial navigation. Smaller vessels gathered to witness their departure. Maritime tradition honoring a historic journey. The Aurora's engines built from idle rumble to working rhythm, powerful vibrations signaling readiness for the challenges ahead. As lines were cast off and the Aurora began moving through the harbor channel, Morgan spotted a sleek vessel approaching rapidly from the Eastern Passage. The distinctive profile was immediately recognizable: Sterling's private yacht, positioning to observe their departure. Even at a distance, his expression conveyed not defeat, but calculated patience. Elizabeth joined Morgan on the bridge, following her gaze to the watching figure. He's not finished. This is merely geographical expansion of the conflict. Morgan nodded, hands steady on controls as the Aurora gathered momentum. He's adaptable, I'll give him that. But so are we. The massive ship moved steadily toward open water, leaving behind the harbor's protective embrace. Ahead lay the Atlantic's vast challenge: unpredictable weather, navigational complexities, and the unknown reception awaiting them internationally. Behind remained the collective's unfinished pursuit, temporarily outmaneuvered but not abandoned. As the shoreline receded and open ocean stretched before them, Sophie stood at the forward observation rail, wind whipping her hair into golden tangles. Her expression held the perfect balance of excitement and determination that had characterized their entire improbable journey. Morgan joined her daughter, watching the horizon line where sky met water. the boundary between what was and what might be. The court observers maintained discreet distance, documenting their departure with professional detachment. Sophie leaned against her mother's side, voice barely audible above wind and engines. "We're going to be okay, aren't we? Not just safe, but really okay." Morgan wrapped an arm around her daughter's shoulders, feeling the ship's powerful momentum beneath them. "We've rebuilt engines, outsmarted billionaires, and turned a forgotten ship into something that matters. Okay is the minimum of what we're going to be." The Aurora star pushed steadily forward, mechanical heart beating with renewed purpose. The journey ahead would bring new challenges, unexpected allies, and inevitable confrontations with the collective's international resources. But Morgan Reynolds had transformed from desperate mechanic to determined guardian, finding strength in precisely the responsibility that should have broken her. As America's coastline disappeared behind them, Morgan felt not anxiety, but profound rightness. The Aurora star had always been meant for movement, carrying precious cargo between worlds, protecting what mattered until it could safely return home. In fulfilling the ship's purpose, she had discovered her own.